I want to play this clip from the Andrew Branca show and why this is probably the most important information that you need to hear, and how police officers can literally get away with killing people, American citizens, without any legal repercussion whatsoever. This is without a doubt some of the most important facts when it comes to police use of force there is. Pay attention very closely and listen to this.
In this case, it's beginning to look, at least initially, as if one of the ICE guys perceived the gun on the suspect, this gun, and took it off his person and was turning away, walking away with the gun to secure it from the suspect. But what might have happened, remember, there's a whole bunch of officers involved. They're not all, Ethernet cable to each other's brains. They're all seeing different things. And one officer might have seen the gun and said the word gun. And that might have triggered that first shot by an officer. And then all the other officers begin shooting in response to that initial discharge. That does not make the shooting unlawful. It would be an awful but lawful shooting. So what's required for the shooting to be lawful? The officers have to have a reasonable perception of an imminent threat of unlawful deadly force harm. That's it. If the answer to that is yes, this is a lawful shoot. They're struggling with this gun. If they perceive this guy as being non-compliant with arrest, fighting with officers, as reaching for a weapon, they will have reasonably perceived an imminent threat of unlawful deadly force harm, justifying their use of deadly defensive force. And their perception does not have to be correct. Their perception has to be reasonable. We're not required to make perfect decisions in self-defense. Police, too. We're required to make reasonable decisions in self-defense. If an officer heard a fellow officer shout gun, and officers are allowed to rely on the expertise of training on their fellow officers, they don't personally need to see the threat themselves. If another officer with whom they're working in that event shouts out that the triggering event has been observed by a fellow officer, that's enough for another officer to resort to the use of deadly defensive force. They're allowed to rely on their reasonable perceptions of the other officer's communications and conduct. Happens all the time because everyone knows the officers have different perspectives or seeing different things at any given time. Every officer does not personally need to see the threat. He has to have a reasonable belief that the threat is present. That can be based on a reliance of what other officers communicate to him. So if one officer shouts gun, all the other officers are going to be prepared to, and some of them will shoot, as appears to be what happened here. When you get in a physical brawl with a bunch of armed law enforcement officers and you have a gun on your person, you're running a serious risk of getting fatally shot in the course of that confrontation. The moment they see that gun, they've reasonably perceived an imminent threat of deadly, unlawful force against them, and they'll justifiably respond with deadly defensive force.
All right, now let's break down the law and how this shooting is and why this is so important for you to pay attention to, and how the standard of law enforcement has been so watered down that anyone at any time who has a uniform on can kill you, and they can get away with it legally. Listen very carefully.
In this case, it's beginning to look, at least initially, as if one of the ICE guys perceived the gun on the suspect, this gun, and took it off his person and was turning away, walking away with the gun to secure it from the suspect. But what might have happened, remember, there's a whole bunch of officers involved. They're not all, Ethernet cable to each other's brains. They're all seeing different things.
Now, remember that, and that's completely fine. I don't want that. I don't want an army of robot cops out there who all hear and see things, but we leverage that, right? Knowledge of one is knowledge of all, and he's going to use this later on to talk about the fact, well, they're not all Ethernet in, but they all act it. So this is where his argument gets countering, because he says off the bat they're all not wired in, right? They're all not wired in. They all see things differently, which is the perception is reality. Some officers are going to view things differently. It's human nature. So he sets the standard. They're all not Ethernet in, so they all should not be acting the same, right?
And one officer might have seen the gun and said the word gun, and that might have triggered that first shot by an officer. And then all the other officers begin shooting in response to that initial discharge.
But I thought they weren't all Ethernet in. So again, this is the hypocrisy of the law. So wait, they don't all see the same thing, but they're all going to act the same. It's as clear as day. They're not all the same. They don't all have the same perception, but one officer can start firing and the rest of them all start firing. Now, I never was trained that way. It always was. It was the concept of being put on the stand. Officer Izzo, you mag dumped and then did it 2 more times. You know, how many rounds does your Glock Model 21 hold? 13 rounds, 1 in the chamber. Okay, and you did that 3 times with method. Did you see at any time whatsoever my client hold a pistol? No. Did you see any threat at all? Did you see an imminent threat at all? You were on the scene with 5 other officers. No. Why did you shoot then? Because Ken said gun. But you didn't see the threat. Yeah, but Ken said gun. But Officer Izzo, you yourself did not see the gun. Well, no. Ken said gun, and then Mike started firing. Let's continue.
That does not make the shooting unlawful. It would be an awful but lawful shooting. So what's required for the shooting to be lawful?
What is required for the shooting to be lawful? Let's listen to this.
The officers have to have a reasonable perception of an imminent threat of unlawful deadly force harm. That's it. If the answer to that is yes, this is a lawful shoot.
That's about as vague as you can get. The officers need to have a reasonable perception of an unlawful threat. According to whom? Have you not seen some of the standards of police officers being hired today? Now, let's not talk about ICE itself. ICE and Border Patrol, they're getting guys through with 6 weeks of online training or 8 weeks of in-person training. It doesn't say anything about their field training. To what I read is that if you have prior law enforcement experience, you get 6 weeks of online training. If you have no prior law enforcement experience, 8 weeks of in-person training. I had 12 in the academy and then an additional 3 months of FTO, and then I was on probation for the rest of my time until I was off. So 18 months total. It doesn't say that here. It doesn't say that these ICE guys are riding if you're less experienced with more experienced, which is going to cause more of a problem. And with the cops we're hiring, these DEI cops that we're hiring 4'11" women, 5'6", 120-pound guys. We are hiring some very physically inept men and women to be police officers. Is it fair or is it reasonable to say that they would perceive the threat differently than a more experienced, seasoned, physically capable police officer would? These are questions to ask.
They're struggling with this gun. If they perceive this guy as being non-compliant with arrest, fighting with officers, as reaching for a weapon, they will have reasonably perceived an imminent threat of unlawful deadly force harm.
Now, remember, that whole perception is a thing, and we're seeing right now, especially with the Pretty shooting, is that he was fighting with the officers. But again, this is all how you word it. It's all how you articulate it. If you pepper spray someone in the face and then 6 of us all jump on top of them, is it reasonable? Is it perceived to be reasonable that this person, in order to have a fight or flight response, would go into self-preservation mode and want to get everyone off of him so he can at least take care of what was blasted in his eyes? Again, whenever we look at use of force, we only look at the reasonable perception from the police officer's point of view, and never, the citizens. Never the citizens. It's always the cop.
Justifying their use of deadly defensive force. And their perception does not have to be correct. Their perception.
I'm sorry. I want to hear what he has to say on that. What was that he just said?
Does not have to be correct. Their perception does not have to be correct.
So again, it is 2:00 in the morning and I'm stopping someone down the street, and due to low light conditions, due to whatever the circumstance is, somebody turns around with a cell phone in their hands and I shoot them and kill them. I can articulate it. My perception is that the way the subject turned around as quickly as he did, to the level of where he had that cell phone in him, I perceived that threat to be a gun. That I was not correct. So again, I am protected. Now, put that into the reasonable perception of somebody with no training, somebody with limited life experience, somebody who was hired and only had 8 weeks worth of training with no practical application, or somebody who's a DEI hire put on your streets, do you think that their perception of a threat would be lesser threshold in executing that force than somebody who's seasoned? In other words, if I went back to law enforcement today, do you think if I went on the street with all of my training and experience, all of my ability, that I would have a different perception of threat than a 21-year-old female who's never even been in a fight before, who was just released from the academy? You have to remember, the law covers these cops regardless of how much time they've had on the job. Somebody could be on their first, very, very first shift, zero training, zero ability, zero experience. They will be protected by the exact same laws as me if I went back in uniform today.
Their perception has to be reasonable. We're not required to make perfect decisions in self-defense. Police, too. We're required to make reasonable decisions in self-defense. If an officer heard a fellow officer shout gun, and officers are allowed to rely on the expertise of training on their fellow officers.
But I had thought he said these officers are not Ethernet in. They're not hive-minded. They're not wired in. But here he says, as I back up to let him speak his own words,
officers shout gun, and officers are allowed to rely on the expertise of training on their fellow officers.
Now, that also goes into play for people with no expertise, because that's such a vague term. Jane Doe gets out of the academy. She has literally 2 shifts on, and she sees gun. Her fellow officers are going to start firing. But we are relying on the training and the expertise, because we sent Jane Doe to Acme Police Academy, where we all went, and she was trained by John, who I've worked with for 7 years on the street. So clearly, she knows through the FTO process. I am confident that she's got the right training, but her experience and her perception is vastly inferior to John's, myself's, Ken's, Mike's, because we've been doing the job for quite a long time. Pay attention to the danger.
They don't personally need to see the threat themselves. If another officer with whom they're working in that event shouts out that the triggering event has been observed,
they do not need to see the threat for themselves. I worked with some phenomenal police officers, Ken, John, Mike, Tim, Tony, all of you guys. And they are men that, because I spent many, many, many years of shift work with, that when Ken would say something, I knew it to be true. When Tim said something, because he had more training, more experience than I do, more years on, I knew it to be true. Same with these other men. How do we apply that then to the non-supposed to be Ethernet in, hive-minded aspect of law enforcement when Jane, who just got on, perceives a threat? I don't need the law. The law covers me. Well, Officer Izzo, why did you shoot? Because Jane called gun. And because we have an established level of trust, because the department clearly made the right decision with hiring Jane. Yes, they hired her because she came from selling shoes at Stride Right. Always wanted to be a police officer, 21 years old. She's a college graduate, high school. That's the extent of her life experience. Has never even seen people in this type of environment before, but because she got nervous, she got scared, watches way too much Chicago PD or crime scene CSI, she yells gun, I shoot and kill the suspect, lawfully covered. Lawfully covered.
by a fellow officer. That's enough for another officer to resort to the use of deadly defensive force. They're allowed to rely on their reasonable perceptions of the other officer's communications and conduct.
Reasonable perception. That is such a dangerous word because we all see and view things differently. Again, if I go up on the street and there's a guy who is reasonably in shape, right? He's big, he's 6'2", and he's built, and he wants to fight me. Well, based on my perception, no, it's not going to be a pistol incident where I go straight to my pistol and do the Indiana Jones. I'm going to go hands-on because I am trained. I am skilled. I am reasonably expected to use level of force that will take this person into custody, but hire somebody inferior, physically inferior, less training, less capability, different gender. That person will have the lawful protection to use deadly force on that person because they perceive the threat as more serious. Do you see? Cops have the lawful authority to kill you for whatever they can create the reasonable perception as.
Happens all the time because
Yes, it
everyone
does.
knows the officers have different perspectives or seeing different things at any given time. Every officer does not personally need to see the threat. He has to have a reasonable belief that the threat is present.
You're not going to call your fellow officers a liar. Again, could you imagine the state? 7 cops on one guy, and he goes, no, he doesn't have a gun. Stop. Well, you're brand new. As though you just came to ICE. You know, we've been doing this for the last 6 weeks on the street. You just got here. Doesn't matter that we had 8 weeks worth of experience and you have 20 in law enforcement. We, the collective, all perceived the gun and the threat. Just because you said no, stand down, doesn't. Do you see the absolute shitstorm this is created? And they're able to kill you. They're able to kill you and lawfully get away with it on the most ambiguous of terms, reasonable perception. Reasonable perception.
That can be based on a reliance of what other officers communicate to him.
Right, but what is based on the reliance of what other officers communicate to him? What's their academy training? What's their continual education? What did this guy have 5 beers? You know, the night before and sleep with a big hangover, and he comes to shift and he's just like, damn, I've got the worst headache on the planet. The guy has got, man, he had a fight with his spouse that day. He's looking actively for a problem. He's somebody who is Christian. His wife is a legal immigrant. He can't stand lesbians, can't stand liberals, can't stand illegal immigrants, and he wants something done about this. He's so frustrated. What is his perception? Maybe he sees something that truly isn't there. We are relying on the reasonable perception from other officers, and cops do not have to see the threat in order to kill you. This is unbelievably dangerous.
So if one officer shouts gun, all the other officers are going to be prepared to, and some of them will shoot, as appears to be what happened here.
Yes. It's trigger happy. It is looking for an excuse. This is the most dangerous precedence that we have set in law enforcement. I've never experienced this. I would have gotten my ass kicked by the cops I worked with if I did see somebody have a cell phone and I said gun and I put them in a position to have to shoot. It would be an incredible investigation. They would probably kick the shit out of me afterwards to learn a lesson that I put them in a position to where now they're going to be prosecuted or sued. This is now, well, if monkeys see, the rest of the monkeys can do. This is the most incredible precedence for law enforcement to be set on the standard of what cops can do simply because one says so. And the lower we drop that threshold for standards of bringing police officers in, the quicker they can kill you. The standard for law doesn't change. It has been this. It was this way when I was a cop. But the trainings for standards for training, the applicant who was hired was of a much higher caliber. Now we're taking that. It's almost as if, we found a loophole. We just have to hire lesser qualified, lesser trained, lesser able police, put them on the street. The law is going to cover us. You can pull the trigger anytime, and that standard doesn't change. But what we're bringing in does. This is beyond dangerous.
When you get in a physical brawl with a bunch of armed law enforcement officers and you have a gun on your person, you're running a serious risk of getting fatally shot.
Because we are bringing in men and women who, A, don't know how to use force, don't know how to fight, and do not know how to perceive whether or not somebody is fighting in the first place. The tactics for the ICE shooting were completely despicable. These ICE are purposely creating problems by using way too much pepper spray, Everybody knows how horrible pepper spray is. When you spray, that whole area is contaminated. So now you have a massive fog of pepper spray released. And then you have 7 cops go in that immediate area where the pepper spray still is. Now all those cops, they're contaminated. Their eyes, they're breathing, they're coughing, they're gagging. Their perception is going to be thrown off. So you have John, who's too afraid to go hands-on, so he pepper sprays. Now the rest of us have to go in. Now our eyes are blinded by the pepper spray. We're choking, we're gagging, and then we see a phone and our perception changes. Gun! And then everybody opens fire. How can you properly acquire your target when you can't see with all that pepper spray? You're choking. How? This standard creates the biggest threat to Americans by law enforcement today.
In the course of that confrontation, the moment they see that gun, they've reasonably perceived an imminent threat of deadly, unlawful force against them, and they'll justifiably respond with deadly defensive force.
You could have the gun in the holster, and again, remember, he doesn't need to remove it from the holster. The law states, if I walk up, hey, do me a favor, don't fucking touch your holster, man. Awesome, problem solved. But Jane could walk up with 0 training, 0 experience, is fresh out of the academy, and say, I'm terrified for my safety because he has a gun in his person, and he's going to remove it and shoot us. Gun, and we all shoot. This is more for you, if you're a police supporter, to understand how the laws are so open to interpretation, and the easier way to manipulate the system is by putting in lesser qualified police officers, and they're flooding our streets daily. DEI, 30 by 30. You think this is a great idea. You support all these police based on their gender, the color of their skin, their background, and you're excluding well-qualified candidates who could do the job and keep the peace and maintain order. And instead, you're putting more and more citizens, including yourself, in harm's way, all because you support diversity and you don't support training and you don't support standards. This alone, this argument from this man alone is proof cops can kill you for any reason they can articulate, and it doesn't have to be that difficult to articulate it anymore, and it is lawfully allowed. The more poorly qualified and trained the cop, doesn't matter. They are still covered by the law. This is beyond dangerous for both our men and women in law enforcement and American citizens.